Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start things off by looking at an item description, though if you have a good memory, it might sound familiar. Yellow Spine, one of the special materials necessary for a Holy Chalice ritual, a special body part from a Healing Church dissection made for the purpose of its exploration. The repulsive odor of decay makes for a kind of bait. By means of the additive rite Rotten Scent Offering, uncommon beings appear. They are often frightening, but should become the subjects of a special hunt. This is exactly the same as the description for the Inflicted Organ, and that's true of both the Japanese and English language versions of these items. Unfortunately, that includes the discrepancies between the two languages that I noted when discussing the Inflicted Organ back in Translationborne 38. But since I've already gone over those, what I'd like to focus on right now is instead a potential trend that involves a number of these ritual materials, but that's easier to see in Japanese than it is in English. It's a trend that involves two pairs of ritual materials, namely those used to perform a fetid offering and those required for a rotted offering. In each of these cases, the descriptions of the items involved in a given offering are exactly the same. That is, the Inflicted Organ's description matches the yellow backbones, just as the item text for the Sage's Wrist and the Sage's Hair are identical. This is because each of these items serves the same purpose. They alter chalice dungeons in specific ways associated either with the scent of rot or the scent of death. The only difference between the first of one of these paired ritual materials and the second is the depth of chalice dungeon they're used to modify. The Inflicted Organ, for instance, can be used to alter depth 3 or depth 4 chalices, whereas the yellow backbone is required for depth 5 chalices. To me, this implies a kind of progression, or an increase in ritual potency from the first of these body parts to the second, and this is where the translation of each item name comes back into play, because I think I can see a kind of logic behind this progression in Japanese. Put simply, the second material in each pair seems to involve a move towards the central nervous system. For the items involved in a rotted offering, the shift is from an organ to the spine, while the materials for fetid offerings go from the wrist to the skull. The skull and spine, of course, house the two broad halves of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, while the wrist and organs are more peripheral. The trouble is, the item that in Japanese is referred to as the Sage's Skull is called the Sage's Hair in English, which makes this potential underlying logic harder to see. Having said that, though, I want to reiterate that I don't think the translation team deliberately chose to obscure this potential set of connections between ritual materials. Especially considering the discrepancies in the translated descriptions for these items, which I noted earlier, I think it's likely that they had their Japanese text revised. That means it's entirely possible that the original item name for what is now the Sage's Skull was in fact Sage's Hair. But whatever the explanation for those items might be, I'm glad that blood trail I decided to follow led us to Arianna. Only, has she just given birth?
It can't be. This is a nightmare.
Arianna? You know, that would probably be my reaction too. Here, I'm going to position myself very carefully so I only hit this infant creature. Well, I guess the tie between mother and child was too strong, possibly because of that third umbilical cord the baby just dropped. If nothing else, that tells us that the little thing was probably an infant great one. As important as those interactions are for the game's lore, though, they only really involve one coherent line of dialogue. That would be Arianna's exclamation of horror and disbelief before she breaks down into crazed laughter, but while it's a short line, I think it's been handled quite well in translation. The official English preserves the sentiment of horrified disbelief and denial using the same sorts of terms as the Japanese, involving first a denial of what's just happened, followed by a statement as to how unreal this feels, such that it resembles an unpleasant dream. Beyond that, though, there's a way in which the official phrasing works with an unlikely but not impossible interpretation of the Japanese. You see, the expression "sonna no uso yo" can be used either to convey incredulity about a situation or to express disbelief about a concrete thing some short distance away. In other words, Arianna could be understood as saying, "That thing over there can't be real." Well, the unfinished expression, "it can't be," could also be taken to refer to the newborn creature, though again, I'd be surprised if that was the intended interpretation in any language. The point is, I think this short but important line was handled well, no matter how you look at it. By the way, if anyone's curious as to what I'm doing, I just wanted to check in on one of the few people left in all of Yharnam who's even half sane and still responsive. But let's check out another item description while we're on our way. Small Tonitrus. The Tonitrus is a unique device-installed weapon from the hand of Archibald, who was known as an eccentric at the Healing Church workshop. This is of the same type as that strange iron ball hammer, and is a thing which uses mercury bullets as a catalyst. When thrust into the ground, it artificially recreates the blue lightning said to blanket a black beast. The efficacy of the catalyst is high, and the lightning is strong. That is the basis for why it is seen as Archibald's masterpiece. So, if you're like me, you were probably thinking that most of that translation was pretty straightforward until suddenly the final two lines were very different. In the official translation, the regular Tonitrus is implicitly identified as Archibald's masterpiece, whereas in my own version, it's the smaller hunter tool that's regarded as his greatest achievement. Well, I actually have a theory as to why these interpretations are so different. I suspect it's the result of mistaking the word Yuen for Yuen. Yes, I realize those two words have the same pronunciation. That's part of what makes things tricky. This is actually a surprisingly common feature of the Japanese language. Because of the way it uses kanji, lots of different words that sound the same have completely different meanings. For instance, entering the term ishi into a Japanese to English dictionary using the phonetic hiragana script returns 11 different exact matches, with meanings that range from doctor to stone, depending on which kanji are used to represent those sounds. Incidentally, I think it's wild how many of these could relate to Bloodborne, but let's get back to the last few lines of the Tiny Tonitrus. Here, the word Yuen is represented by a pair of kanji that would not normally be read that way. Based on their typical readings, you'd expect this term to be read as shoi or something, but this is a special case. When the term Yuen is represented by these kanji, it is used to indicate that the preceding phrase is the reason for something, as can be seen in the example sentence from my Daijujin Japanese dictionary, which I might somewhat literally translate as, "The reason he is well liked can be found in his cheerfulness." When applied to the relevant sentence in Bloodborne, you get the idea that the effectiveness of the catalyst and the powerful lightning are the reasons why the Tiny Tonitrus is considered Archibald's masterpiece. But what if you took this unusual pair of kanji as basically an alternate spelling for a different word also pronounced Yuen? After all, another common feature of Japanese is using more than one set of kanji for a word, with only the subtlest changes in meaning. And as it turns out, this other Yuen also has an explanatory nuance, but it tends to be more tied into the origin of something. For instance, the example sentence provided for this term could be translated as an inquiry into the reason a particular area has the name that it does, but it comes across more as a request for the origin of the place name than anything. So there is a lot of potential similarity here, but when applied to the sentence in Bloodborne, it completely changes the interpretation of the line. By this understanding, the high conductivity and powerful sparks of the Tiny Tonitrus position it as the origin or prototype for what's regarded as Archibald's masterpiece, which by implication would be the regular Tonitrus. So if this is the explanation for the discrepancy, I hope it's also clear how easily these versions of Yuen can be mixed up. I even came across a handful of articles addressing this for native speakers while doing my research. Still, the end result is that in English, Archibald's masterpiece is implied to be the underappreciated Tonitrus, whereas in Japanese, while the Tonitrus isn't well received by Archibald's peers, the smaller version is prized for its power. But there is another powerful hunter tool, an appeal to the far side, one of the secret rituals of the upper echelons of the Healing Church, the Holy Song Troupe. Once, the Healing Church made contact with superdimensional darkness using spirits as intermediaries. They attempted to correspond with the far-distant star realm, but everything ended in vain. In other words, this is a failed product. However, the ritual is accompanied by the small explosion of a star, and this became a special power of the Holy Song Troupe. Truly, failure is the mother of success. Now, here is a translation that I really like, one with a lot of subtle touches that I think are worth exploring, beginning right with the name of the item. What makes this hunter tool something of a challenge to name is that both of the key concepts involved, the part translated as call and the part translated as beyond, have a couple of different relevant meanings that could apply. The Japanese for call is yobikake, and my Daijisen Japanese dictionary provides both the straightforward sense of a vocal means of getting others' attention, and the more figurative sense of an appeal for aid or cooperation. As for beyond, it comes from the word kanata, which can refer either to a place or time distant from everyone involved in a conversation, or to something on the other side of an obstruction, such as a location across the sea or on the other side of a mountain. To emphasize this alternative set of meanings, I deliberately used the phrase, an appeal to the far side, in my more literal version, but I think the official translation is so good at covering a similarly broad sense of meaning in English that my own rendering probably just seems like a rougher name for the same thing. In that regard, I think the use of the word beyond was particularly inspired, because it pretty much covers both senses of the original Japanese term. Obviously, it has the straightforward meaning, on the other side of, but it can also be used figuratively to represent distance, like you might hear in the expression, the back of beyond. What's more, it brings in associations of that which exceeds our normal understanding, as evidenced by phrases such as, the great beyond, or what lies beyond. This is especially fitting because this name is supposed to belong to a secret ritual, not just an item. Of course, the word call technically has this same versatility. A call for peace, for example, is an appeal for the end of hostilities. But I don't think that sense of the term comes through as clearly in the specific context of this item name. Instead, what I believe this term has going for it is a consideration of the item's description, where the choir is said to have attempted to make contact with a distant plane. Since this ritual seems to have been aimed at establishing communications rather than to make requests, using the term call instead of something like appeal makes a lot of sense to me. This actually brings me to one final reason I like the name A Call Beyond, but before I get to it, I need to elaborate on the linguistic nuance behind this idea of reaching out to another plane. In Japanese, the key verb for what the choir is attempting to do is koushin, and while this literally refers to an exchange of information through some manner of signals, it has a strong association with wireless communication in general and radio operation in particular. In other words, the original employs terminology associated with radio use to get at the idea that the choir sent out a signal in hopes of reaching a distant being. Well, in English ham radio terminology, the analogous process is called making contact, and I don't think it's an accident that this is the exact phrase the translators use here. For one thing, they seem to have gone out of their way not to use it earlier. You see, there's another phrase in the Japanese describing how the choir got in touch with a higher plane that I literally translated as make contact. Only in this case, the official English employs the term reach, possibly in order to use the more radio-associated phrase later. What's more, there's another instance where we've seen the Japanese term koushin translated as make contact, in the name of a gesture. Here, despite more literal terms such as correspond or communicate being possibilities, they're not used. Now, there are other reasons why this wording might be preferred for the gesture, such as an allusion to the idea of making first contact with aliens. However, this radio connection could also explain why the gesture looks the way that it does. When the player character spreads out their arms, the effect is somewhat reminiscent of an antenna, which also fits wording that we'll see when we get around to examining the cage Micolash had on his head. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, suffice it to say that it's this potential tie to radio terminology that's also the last reason I like the item name being translated the way that it is, because the idea of making a call is inherent in the phrasing, a call beyond. Now, I should mention that there's another potential connection in this item description that's not recreated so faithfully in English, though it's one I'm less sure of. In Japanese, the phrase seikai is used to describe the location that the choir attempted to establish communications with, and this is in fact the same set of kanji as in the boss name for the celestial emissary, seikai kara no shisha. So it's possible that in reaching out to that star world or star realm, the choir may have succeeded in contacting and calling down the emissaries, even though their overall project ended in failure. Having said that though, I don't see this as a huge loss in terms of translation. Despite the distinctive English phrasing, it seems clear enough to me that in seeking to communicate with the outer reaches of the cosmos, the choir would have discovered celestial beings. Plus, as I've commented before, the term seikai, or star world, is pretty vague, such that even using the same word, I'm not sure it's a reference to the same place. Again, all in all, I'm very impressed with the translation of this item description, and there are still a few great touches I haven't even mentioned yet, like how the weird concept of superdimensional darkness is broken down into the more comprehensible, lofty plane of darkness, or the strategic use of the English phrase, failure is the mother of invention. But that's all I have time for. As always, please let me know if you have any feedback for me, and until next time, thanks for watching, everyone.